Welcome to Paskvan Podcasts. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps this channel. Today we're opening a set of sources that detail a century-old investigation. It's a story about how a seemingly perfect summer day in 1904 became one of New York City's most profound losses of life.
It's a heavy one.
It is. We're going to be examining the events leading up to, during, and after the sinking of a vessel known as the General Slocum. But this is it's a story that goes far beyond just a maritime tragedy. It's really a forensic analysis of hidden dangers, of institutional decay, and what can only be described as systemic betrayal.
And that element of systemic failure is absolutely critical to understanding the true scale of what happened. It really is. When you analyze the documents, we're talking thousands of pages of official reports, survivor testimony, Senate hearings, you see it clearly.
Yeah, exactly.
That the Slocum disaster wasn't some unavoidable accident. It wasn't a freak storm or a sudden collision. It was a manufactured tragedy. It was built slowly, deliberately, over years of cost-cutting, of ignored regulations, and frankly, deep-seated corruption within both the inspection agencies and the company that operated the ship.
Okay, so before we get into the technical failures and the mechanics of the disaster, let's try to immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of that morning. Let's set the scene.
Right.
We begin on June 15th, 1904. We're in Manhattan's Lower East Side. This area at the time was known as Kleindeutschland, or Little Germany. It was this vibrant, dense community defined by a shared language, culture, and traditions.
And Kleindeutschland wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a complete socioeconomic ecosystem. It was characterized by extreme density, housing tens of thousands of recent German immigrants, often crammed into tenements.
They had their own whole world there.
Completely. Their own German language schools, their own churches, banks, newspapers. The men, they often held these grueling, skilled industrial jobs, meaning they had to work 6 days a week. They really relied on these tight-knit social structures for stability.
And this specific day, June 15th, this was the big one. It represented the pinnacle of their annual social calendar. This was the annual excursion and picnic for the St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church. And our sources, they paint a beautiful picture, don't they? Bright, untroubled sunshine, a gentle breeze coming off the river.
It was a collective moment of sanctuary, a moment of pure joy. It was this rare escape from the oppressive city heat and the grinding labor of their daily lives.
Can only imagine the excitement.
We have these really detailed accounts of mothers carefully dressing their children, packing enormous baskets of food, sausages, cakes, lemonade, all of it destined for the shores of Long Island. The expectation, the sheer relief, it was palpable. For so many of them, this was the only vacation day they would get all year.
And the focal point, the vehicle for all this communal joy, was the steamship they had chartered. The General Slocum.
The Slocum was enormous, built in 1891, a very large sidewheel passenger steamer. And to the community gathered on that 3rd Street pier, she must have been a magnificent sight, the jewel of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company.
So she looked the part.
Oh, absolutely. Her external presentation was all wide open decks, a spacious brass-railed promenade, and newly polished wooden cabins.
She looked dependable, stately, and, above all, she looked safe.
100%. By 9:30 in the morning, she was heavily laden with over 1,300 passengers. And here's a demographic detail that is just heartbreakingly important. The overwhelming majority were women and children.
The fathers stayed behind to work.
The fathers and husbands, yes. They stayed behind, waved goodbye from the pier, and they had placed their unquestioning trust in this festive-looking ship, in the experienced captain, and of course, in the government certification process. They had no reason at all to suspect that they were watching their entire community sail toward its complete destruction.
And here is the profound irony of it all, the central chilling point of this whole investigation.
Yeah.
While that band was playing and the Slocum was steaming away from the pier, she was already a fatal trap. Beneath that polished facade lay profound structural decay and just calculated negligence.
It was systemic betrayal hiding in plain sight. It really was. The sources confirmed the disaster was inevitable, not because of storm, not because of a collision, but because every single safety component mandated by law had been quietly, deliberately rendered non-functional years before the General Slocum ever even left the dock that day.
Okay, let's unpack this. So before the Slocum even left the dock, the basic instruments of survival hoses, boats, and preservers were guaranteed failures. The passengers were already in a desperate situation. They just didn't know it yet.
That's exactly right. They were doomed from the start.
So let's get into the anatomy of this floating trap.
Okay, so let's delve into those hidden failures that came long before the fire. When the General Slocum was launched back in the early 1890s, she was state-of-the-art, a real marvel. But by 1904, she was run down. Seriously run down.
And the company knew this.
The Knickerbocker Steamship Company was notorious for it, maximizing revenue while performing the absolute minimum required maintenance. And this leads us to the crucial discussion of what we can call the tarnish of time.
What specifically were the signs of decay that should have been addressed? I mean, how did years of heavy service contribute so directly to what happened?
Well, river steamers, like the Slocum, they operate in this cycle of fresh and brackish water, which, it just accelerates wear and tear. The hull was sound enough, but the superstructure, the decks, the internal walls, that was all wood. And it was subject to this relentless exposure, drying out in the sun.
So it becomes brittle.
Brittle and highly combustible. Our sources indicate that rather than replacing aging wood, the company prioritized cosmetic applications, new layers of paint every season.
Just paint over the problem.
Exactly. It created this facade of soundness, but it was masking accelerating dry rot in the structural supports. It was making the ship exceptionally flammable.
So the ship was essentially just becoming kindling, waiting for a spark. And that spark, we know, it originated in a forward storage compartment.
Yes. The origin point is traced to a small forward storage area. It was beneath the main deck, intended for things like cleaning supplies, paint thinner, brags. And this area, which was located right near the forward passenger cabin, was structurally a known fire trap.
A known fire trap.
Yes. It was poorly ventilated and, well, it was rarely cleaned thoroughly.
And what did the investigation conclude about what was actually in that space?
They found evidence of highly combustible materials, greasy rags saturated with oil, straw that was used for packing, and highly flammable cleaning solvents. The consensus is that spontaneous combustion likely occurred hours or maybe even a full day before the Slocum sailed.
A whole day?
It's possible. The fire was just smoldering, slowly consuming the dry wood structure around it, just waiting for the right moment and the right draft of air to erupt. The ticking clock started long before a single passenger stepped on board.
Which brings us to the most damning indictment of the company and the regulators, the failure of the safety equipment. The sheer scale of negligence here is just stunning. Let's start with the immediate response when the crew first saw smoke.
Okay, so when the deckhand noticed the smoke near East 90th Street, just minutes after 10 a.m., the crew's first reaction was to attack the flames with the ship's internal fire hoses. And this immediate effort failed. Utterly.
Why?
The hoses were dry rotted.
Dry rot is insidious, isn't it? Doesn't look like decay until you put it under stress.
Precisely. The lack of use, the exposure to ambient heat, it had caused the canvas and the rubber linings of the hoses to become brittle. So when the crew turned on the water pumps, trying to direct a powerful stream toward the flames, the increased pressure was just too much.
They burst.
They didn't just leak. They burst open, spraying water uselessly onto the deck, soaking the fleeing passengers instead of the fire. The crew, who were already poorly trained to begin with, were rendered completely helpless.
So, if the fire couldn't be fought, the passengers' only real chance lay in evacuation. That means the lifeboats. What did the sources reveal about their condition?
This is where the cynicism just reaches its peak. The lifeboats were completely 100% non-functional. They existed for one reason only: to pass a perfunctory inspection.
What do you mean?
They had been painted in place for years by maintenance crews, layer upon layer of cheap enamel and marine paint. This fusing of the boat to the ship's rail and its wooden supports meant they were immovably cemented in their davits, the mechanical arms used to lower them.
So they were stage props. They weren't actual vehicles of rescue.
They were worse than props. They were actively misleading. They offered this illusion of safety while preventing any hope of escape. And not only that, they had often been wired into the davits, usually with simple, thin utility wires, just to make sure they wouldn't accidentally shift or look untidy.
And after years of that?
After years, these wires had rusted solid. They were iron bonds. Crew members who tried desperately to deploy them later testified to using axes, hammers, anything they could find, only to discover the bows were completely fused to the steamer's superstructure.
The sources mentioned that when one bow was eventually, by sheer force, pried loose, it didn't even survive the fall.
That's correct. The wooden structure of the lifeboat itself, having been exposed to the elements without proper maintenance for years, was so riddled with rot that when it dropped about 15 feet into the water, it shattered into 1,000 pieces.
Unbelievable.
It confirmed that even if they had somehow managed to launch the others, they couldn't have held the weight of a single person. They were just inanimate decorations, utterly useless.
And that leads us to the most horrifying betrayal of all, the life preservers. Every single person who sought safety during that fire relied on these small devices.
The failure of the life preservers, it just illustrates the depths of the cost-cutting measures. Legally, they were required to be stuffed with high-grade, buoyant materials like kapok fiber or high-quality cork. The investigation uncovered that the Knickerbocker Steamship Company had substituted this material with the cheapest filler available.
Which was?
Granulated cork dust.
Dust.
Yes.
And what was the difference in cost? Why did this matter so fatally?
The cost difference was negligible on an individual unit, maybe a few cents. But across the thousands of required preservers, it translated to substantial savings for the company. The material itself was the problem. Cork dust is highly absorptive. So over the 13 years the Slocum had been in service, that dust compacted. It turned into this dense, heavy substance that investigators later described as feeling like stone or wet cement.
So they looked fine on the outside.
Yes, the canvas covers had been painted repeatedly. They looked perfectly fine, but inside they were saturated with moisture.
Meaning that the moment they hit the water, they would absorb even more weight and become anchors.
Precisely. They became heavy, waterlogged weights. The profound horror documented in the sources is the testimony of surviving parents. They described strapping these devices onto their own children, believing they were giving them a chance to float.
Oh, no.
Instead, the devices pulled them down swiftly beneath the surface of the East River. It was a complete reversal of their intended purpose. They turned the instruments of safety into instruments of drowning.
So if we synthesize this first part, we're seeing these 3 layers of failure all compounding the threat. First, the dry-rotted structure of the ship, making it extremely flammable.
Right.
Second, the complete failure of the active defense systems, the fire hoses.
Useless.
And third, the absolute failure of the passive escape systems, the cemented lifeboats and the heavy preservers. The sources definitively proved the passengers had zero chance of survival the moment those flames started.
It was a disaster just waiting for a trigger. And that trigger, that small fire, it found a vessel that was optimized for catastrophe. The lack of crew training only made it worse, but even the most highly trained crew in the world couldn't have fought a fire with disintegrating hoses or launched lifeboats that were fused to the deck.
The structural negligence now gives way to the rapid escalation of the incident itself. So it's just after 10 a.m., the fire erupts near East 90th Street, and the response from the crew is, as we've established, immediately hampered by these mechanical failures.
The speed of the fire's spread remains one of the most chilling details. Once that compartment hatch was opened and the fire received a rush of oxygen, the flames immediately began racing along the highly flammable, dry-rotted wooden superstructure. And the sources note this terrible irony, that pleasant, gentle breeze coming off the East River that everyone was enjoying, it instantly became a deadly accelerant.
It acted like a forced draft, just channeling the heat and the smoke through the main decks and the passenger cabins. How quickly did the Slocum go from a sightseeing steamer to a floating inferno?
We're talking about minutes. Contemporary accounts suggest within 6 to 8 minutes of the initial sighting, the fire was fully out of control. The forward cabin was consumed and the flames were spreading rapidly aft. The sources detail this sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The band just stops playing. The shouts of joy turn into shrieks of confusion and despair.
And the crew response was clearly inadequate, which, that speaks volumes about the lack of mandatory training at the time.
Oh, it was non-existent. The investigation revealed that many of the deckhands were seasonal, temporary hires with very little formal training. So when the fire began, there was no centralized command structure. You had crew members shouting conflicting orders, some telling passengers to stay put, others urging them to jump.
Which just adds to the chaos.
It compounded it, transforming passenger fear into full-blown panic.
Let's focus on the experiences of the passengers. They're forced to make these impossible choices. The failure of the lifeboats and the heavy preservers meant their escape options were zero.
They were facing fire above and water below, and both promised a terrible end. Those trapped on the main decks faced unimaginable heat. Testimony described how the decking became so hot that people's shoes literally melted to the wood.
Oh, that's horrific.
And the thick, acrid black smoke fueled by paint, wood, all those solvents, it quickly filled the air, making it impossible to breathe. Survivors recounted trying to inhale, but finding only, and this is a quote, lethal smoke pushing down their throats.
And then came that moment of realization about the life preservers.
That was the apex of the horror. We have to acknowledge the sheer cruelty of that realization. Witness accounts repeatedly detailed mothers carefully securing these canvas vests onto their children, only to see the children hit the water and instantly sink. The heavy, waterlogged devices ensuring they went straight to the bottom.
And the East River isn't calm water.
No, it has strong, deceptive currents. And coupled with the weight of those faulty preservers, survival was nearly impossible, especially for a child.
So as the fire is consuming the Slocum, which is now this glowing pyre on the water, the ship's course becomes the central point of contention. The captain, William Van Schaik, he had to choose where to ground the ship.
Right.
But instead of aiming for the relatively close, shallow Manhattan shoreline, say, near 90th Street, he continued upstream.
And this decision defined the final, fatal moments of the disaster. Captain Van Schaik, he was injured, partially blinded by smoke in the wheelhouse, but he maintained speed, steering the ship toward North Brother Island.
What was his professional reasoning for choosing such a remote destination?
His defense, which was detailed in his subsequent trial, was that he feared grounding the burning steamer on the congested Manhattan waterfront. He argued that doing so would risk a collision with dozens of small vessels, it could spread the fire to the docks, and, importantly, adjacent oil refineries.
So a bigger disaster.
That was his argument. He believed North Brother Island, which at the time housed a quarantined infectious disease hospital, was the quickest and safest place to run the ship aground without causing a larger metropolitan catastrophe.
That sounds like a calculated risk. But his critics argued that the decision to maintain speed was far more lethal than the risk of hitting a dock.
The critics were vehement and, their logic holds up to scrutiny. Maintaining speed, even for just a few minutes, provided a continuous gale-force draft of oxygen to the fire. It turned the decks into an active blast furnace. Every knot of speed accelerated the rate at which the wooden superstructure was consumed.
So if he had just grounded the ship immediately...
If he had grounded the ship immediately on the Manhattan shore, even imperfectly, passengers could have jumped into shallower water. They might have been able to walk ashore.
So the argument is that his focus on navigational safety, on protecting the city, inadvertently maximized the casualties on his own ship.
Absolutely. The sources strongly suggest that those few extra minutes spent steaming toward North Brother Island meant the difference between a small percentage of casualties and the catastrophic loss of over 1,000 lives. The sustained speed trapped passengers deep inside the burning vessel, forcing them to jump from greater heights into the swirling, treacherous currents of the East River, often burdened by those worthless preservers. It was just a tragic, compounded failure of decision-making under extreme stress.
The final seconds of the Slocum's journey must have been just sheer hell, with fire leaping from the masts and the sound of screaming amplified by the buildings along the shore.
It was a horrific descent into chaos. When the ship finally scraped to a halt off the southern shore of North Brother Island, the remaining structure was collapsing. Hundreds of people were already in the water, clinging to anything that floated. Sometimes, tragically, debris from the shattered lifeboats. The fire had done its work, and now the river was claiming the rest.
The scene at North Brother Island, then, was immediately transformed into a mass triage center and a temporary morgue.
Yes. The hospital staff, doctors, nurses, orderlies, they rushed to the shore. They had witnessed the burning vessel approach. They were expecting dozens of victims. They were met with hundreds.
The scale of the devastation must have just instantly overwhelmed their capacity.
It did. The sources paint this grim picture of rescuers wading into the water, pulling out victims. The sight was overwhelming. Survivors suffering from deep burns, shock, extreme smoke inhalation, and they were right alongside the waterlogged dead. They laid the victims out along the slopes and porches of the hospital, attempting these desperate resuscitation efforts, but the vast majority were already gone.
And the recovery effort, which went on for days, was particularly grim because the victims all belonged to that same tight-knit neighborhood.
That centralized loss just amplified the trauma. The East River yielded its dead slowly, reluctantly. Bodies continued to surface for days afterwards, sometimes miles downstream. It was not uncommon for recovery teams to find clusters, mothers still clutching their children, often 3 or 4 family members found united in their final moments.
In the final count.
Over 1,021 lives were lost in total, a figure so immense that for decades the Slocum disaster held the grim title of New York City's deadliest peacetime incident.
As that initial shock subsided, it quickly curdled into this profound public fury. This wasn't perceived as an unavoidable tragedy, was it? It was recognized instantly as a preventable act of negligence.
The outrage was immediate because survivors, once they were coherent, they all started recounting the same horrifying details. The bursting hoses, the immovable lifeboats, and the preservers that functioned as sinkers. The entire city understood that these people had not perished in some natural disaster. They were victims of calculated, professional betrayal.
And the public demanded accountability, targeting 3 groups: Captain Van Schaik, the Knickerbocker Steamship Company executives, and the Government Inspection Service.
And the sources reveal that the focus immediately crystallized on Captain Van Schaik. He was the most visible figure, right? He was the one who made that final, controversial decision about the ship's course. He faced a relentless trial where prosecutors argued his actions amounted to criminal negligence.
And he was the only one convicted.
The only one, correct. Van Schaik was convicted and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in Sing Sing prison. And the sources really suggest he became the ultimate scapegoat. Well, while his judgment in those final moments was certainly flawed, the system essentially needed a visible villain to absorb the public's wrath. It diverted attention from the powerful company owners and the institutional failure of the federal government itself.
That brings us to the controversial pardon, years later, by President William Howard Taft.
Yes, Taft's decision in 1911 to pardon Van Schaik, citing the captain's age, his declining health, and the idea that he had suffered sufficiently, it was highly contentious. But the sources also highlight the deeper rationale, that the captain, in the eyes of many officials, had unjustly carried the full weight of a corporate and bureaucratic catastrophe.
While the company itself got off easy.
The Knickerbocker Steamship Company faced only nominal fines. Their executives escaped prison entirely. It made the captain's solitary sentence look increasingly unjust over time.
Meanwhile, the real systemic failures were being laid bare in the Senate hearings, which focused on the inspection service. This is where the structural corruption was finally unveiled, not just negligence, but active malfeasance.
Those Senate hearings provided some of the most damning testimony imaginable. Investigators proved unequivocally that the Slocum's lifeboats had not been lowered, tested, or maintained in over a decade. They actually tried to demonstrate the lifeboat's operation for the committee, and several of the brittle, rotting structures literally crumbled under their touch.
The visual evidence must have been devastating for the senators and the public watching.
It was visceral proof that the inspection certificates were completely fraudulent. And the focus then shifted to the inspectors themselves. Witnesses testified that the inspectors rarely, if ever, actually boarded the vessels they were supposed to be inspecting.
So how were they signing off?
They would sign off on the required documentation in exchange for small favors, a good cigar, or cash payments that were effectively bribes. The industry standard had become a simple paperwork exchange. It protected the inspector's time and, of course, the company's profits.
This sounds like a widespread, industry-wide problem, not just an isolated incident with the Slocum.
It was an entrenched culture of regulatory capture. The steamship companies wielded significant lobbying power, and the government agency responsible for oversight, the Steamboat Inspection Service, was notoriously underfunded and prone to corruption. Whistleblowers confirmed that the Slocum, being an aging vessel, was a known issue. But raising red flags meant risking one's career against powerful interests. Compliance was based on appearance, not function.
And the final piece of evidence that fueled the public rage was the meticulous analysis of what was inside those preservers.
That revelation struck at the core moral compact. When investigators presented the compacted, heavy cork dust detailing the minimal cost savings achieved by sacrificing safety, the public understood the direct trade-off. A few dollars saved by executives translated directly into the drowning of hundreds of children. It confirmed that the loss of life was not a side effect of the fire, but a guaranteed outcome of corporate greed.
The psychological toll resulting from these revelations must have been immense, particularly for the men who stayed behind to work that day.
The guilt carried by the surviving fathers and husbands was profound. They had fulfilled their responsibility as providers, believing the city's systems would protect their families for one day of respite. Instead, they were left alone, having lost nearly every member of their immediate family. And the trauma was compounded by the fact that they knew the disaster was entirely preventable. It was caused by fraud, not by fate.
And we also have to acknowledge the invisible wounds that were suffered by the rescue personnel.
Absolutely. The sources indicate that the nurses, the doctors, even the police officers involved in the recovery suffered severe psychological distress, what we would today recognize as extreme post-traumatic stress. Working at the makeshift morgues on North Brother Island, identifying victims, often entire families, it was overwhelming. Many reported being haunted for years by the sight of the burnt and drowned bodies, unable to sleep without hearing the faint, echoing screams that had drifted across the river. The psychological devastation was widespread and largely unaddressed in that era.
This detailed analysis really clearly demonstrates that the systemic failure didn't just cause the loss of life, it led to the complete dissolution of an entire established community.
The impact on Kleindeutschland wasn't just statistical, it was cultural extinction. Before June 15, 1904, the area around St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church was the beating heart of German immigrant life in Manhattan. After the Slocum, it was rendered a ghost town.
How exactly did one disaster wipe out a neighborhood's identity so completely?
The loss was focused entirely on the non-working demographic, the women and the children. This meant that the community's reproductive capacity, its cultural inheritors, and its primary caregivers were removed in a single strike. Entire family lines were extinguished. The church lost over half of its congregation, and many of the men lost nearly all of their children, leaving behind single, grieving parents.
The sources describe a neighborhood that was just overcome by a pervasive sense of sorrow.
Grief was physically manifested everywhere you looked. Black mourning ribbons draped from virtually every window in the tenements. The streets, normally bustling with German conversation and children playing, they just fell silent. The air was thick with the weight of loss. How could you live among so many empty apartments, knowing that every street corner offered a painful reminder of a lost child or a lost wife?
It seems the survivors had to flee, not just to move on, but to escape the geography of their own trauma.
That's precisely right. The sources confirm a rapid, acute demographic shift. Families packed up and moved in waves, scattering across the outer boroughs of New York or moving west. They just couldn't psychologically sustain life in a place defined by such devastating absence.
And the community just vanished.
Within 5 years, the vibrant cultural institutions of Kleindeutschland, the German bakeries, the social clubs, the specific newspapers, they had all faded away. New immigrant groups, primarily Jewish and Italian, moved into the now cheap, vacated tenements. The German identity of that specific section of the Lower East Side was effectively extinguished by a single afternoon of maritime negligence.
This acute societal collapse carried an immense cost, but it did finally force the federal government to implement necessary safety changes. What specific maritime reforms did the Slocum disaster catalyze?
The public outcry was just too loud, and the evidence of corruption too blatant to ignore. The Slocum became the pivotal example leading directly to the Steamboat Inspection Act of 1905, and that was followed by broader regulatory changes. These reforms were comprehensive, and they targeted every single flaw exposed by the disaster.
Let's detail some of those specific mandates. What changed?
Okay, first, inspections became more rigorous, more frequent, and absolutely mandatory. Secondly, lifeboats and all emergency equipment had to be demonstrably tested. They had to be lowered into the water regularly.
So no more just painting them in place.
Never again. Inspectors were now required to sign affidavits detailing the exact time and location of their inspection activities. And crucially, the reforms addressed the material failure. The buoyancy standards for life preservers were dramatically raised, outlawing the use of cheap, inadequate materials like cork dust.
So the families lost that day effectively paid the highest price possible for modern maritime safety.
They did. Furthermore, crew training became mandatory, focusing on fire drills, evacuation procedures, crowd control, and emergencies. And perhaps most importantly, for breaking that cycle of corruption, falsifying inspection records or accepting bribes was elevated from a minor bureaucratic issue to a severe criminal offense. It ensured the inspectors themselves faced genuine legal liability for negligence.
Despite those profound and necessary reforms, the memory of the General Slocum slowly receded from the national consciousness. Why did a disaster of this scale eventually slip into historical invisibility?
There are a few key reasons for that. First, the demographic nature of the tragedy meant that the victims were confined to one rapidly dissolving immigrant community. Once those families scattered, the unified voice of remembrance it diminished. Second, it was tragically overshadowed by subsequent major events.
Like the Titanic.
Exactly. Just 8 years later, the sinking of the Titanic captured the global imagination. You had tales of high society victims, international news, and closer to home, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911 focused New York's attention on workplace safety.
So the Slocum disaster became a localized grief that lacked the continuous national resonance of those later events.
Precisely. While annual memorials were held for decades, they dwindled until only a handful of elderly survivors and their descendants attended. For generations of New Yorkers, the story of the General Slocum became a forgotten footnote, a localized horror story, rather than a national symbol of regulatory failure.
But for the survivors, the trauma was lifelong. The sources indicate that many struggled with deep, lingering physical and psychological injuries.
The physical wounds, the burns, and the smoke damage were often permanent, but the psychological scars were perhaps worse. We have accounts of survivors who lived with this chronic guilt. Guilt for surviving when their siblings didn't, or for having been unable to hold on to a drowning loved one. In an era where psychological support was virtually non-existent, they carried these silent burdens. The cold darkness of the river became a recurring, inescapable image in their lives.
And that intensity of localized grief contributed to the persistent folklore and the haunting shadows surrounding the event.
Yes, the cultural memory of the tragedy took on an almost supernatural dimension. The sheer volume of loss in one concentrated space left an undeniable imprint on the geography. People living along the East River, particularly near North Brother Island, which was already a place of isolation and quarantine, they began reporting strange phenomena.
Tell us about those enduring local legends. What did people claim to see or hear?
Well, there are countless tales of ghostly figures drifting along the shoreline near the wreck site. Faint, chilling echoes of children crying carried on foggy mornings across the water. Fishermen and later demolition crews working on the abandoned hospital structures of North Brother Island reported feelings of immense unease, cold spots, the sound of whispers in the empty wards. The idea, which became deeply rooted in local tradition, is that the river itself remembers what the world tries to forget. It ensures that the sorrow associated with the Slocum remains imprinted on the landscape.
The story of the Slocum, then, it really stands as this brutal reminder of the real human cost associated with unchecked institutional complacency.
It does. Our sources confirm that the system was perfectly aware of the risks, the known flaws, the blatant corruption, yet it chose inaction until the disaster provided the necessary horrible catalyst for change. The Slocum was a tragedy that occurred entirely on paper before it ever happened in the water.
The analysis forces us to synthesize this terrible knowledge. The families who boarded the Slocum expected laughter and sunshine. They were betrayed by those who prioritized profit and bureaucratic ease over human protection. The negligence was not a harmless oversight, but a silent force that turned a peaceful river outing into a mass grave.
They placed their trust in a government certification system that was rotten, a shipping company that was fraudulent, and safety equipment that was guaranteed to fail. That instantaneous transformation from celebration to catastrophe serves as a powerful historical warning.
The story forces us to confront how quickly joy can turn into catastrophe when we blindly trust systems that lack transparency and rigorous oversight. The profound question for you to explore is this: in what areas of modern life, from infrastructure maintenance to digital security systems, are we currently relying on unseen systems of safety that might be quietly compromised by complacency or corruption, just waiting for the inevitable moment of failure?
We encourage you to explore the historical preservation efforts related to the Lower East Side community and the Slocum's victims. It helps ensure that the memory of those families, those ordinary people who sought a single day of happiness, is not lost to time, and that the lessons of accountability remain learned.